In the heart of downtown Meridian, under a sky streaked with the early blush of dawn, Kenesha Harper stepped into the imposing marble building of the Meridian Superior Court. The city was just beginning to stir, its streets echoing with the distant hum of commuters and the muted chatter of early risers, but inside the cool, silent corridors of the courthouse, time seemed to hold its breath. Dressed in a sharply tailored navy suit, her dark skin radiant under the soft glow of the lobby's chandeliers, Kenesha carried herself with a blend of poise and quiet determination that commanded respect. Every measured step she took was a testament to years of hard-fought battles in the field, where she had learned that dignity and perseverance were the ultimate weapons against injustice. Kenesha was not merely another face in the crowd of legal professionals, she was a seasoned agent of the U.S. Secret Service, whose record of integrity and bravery had become the stuff of whispered legends among her colleagues. Yet today, she entered the courtroom not as an enforcer of national security protocols on a high-stakes protective detail, but as a key witness in a complex financial fraud case that had quickly become a symbol of systemic corruption in Meridian. Her testimony was expected to dismantle a sophisticated web of deceit spun by local officials whose greed had tainted every corner of the city's governance. The case was more than numbers and paper trails, it was a battle for the soul of Meridian, and Kenesha was determined to let truth prevail, regardless of the cost. As she made her way through the ornate corridors lined with historic portraits and heavy wooden doors, Kenesha couldn't help but recall the long, arduous journey that had brought her here. Born and raised in a community where dreams were often stifled by prejudice, she had fought her way through countless obstacles to emerge as a beacon of hope and integrity. Her childhood had been marked by the constant struggle to prove that strength and honor could reside in a black woman, a notion that many had dismissed with condescending laughter. Now, every step she took was a silent defiance of that old narrative, a living reminder that the quiet strength of one could challenge the status quo. In the bustling atrium, where the chatter of lawyers and clerks mingled with the distant toll of a clock, Kenesha paused for a moment to center herself. The weight of the upcoming testimony pressed upon her like the solemn duty of an ancient guardian. She opened her leather-bound portfolio, its contents meticulously organized, case files, financial records, and several documents that traced suspicious transactions back to a network of corrupt city officials. Each page was a fragment of a larger story, one that revealed the insidious reach of greed and the silent betrayal of those entrusted with power. As she reviewed the evidence one last time, her thoughts were interrupted by murmurs of anticipation from nearby onlookers. She knew that all eyes in the courtroom would be fixed on her when she took the stand, not only to witness the facts she would present but also to see her, a woman who had been underestimated and ridiculed, claim her rightful place as an authority. Outside, the city moved in rhythm with its own pulse, but inside, a storm of tension was brewing. The media had caught wind of the case, and whispers of scandal were already circulating, hinting that even the highest echelons of local power might be implicated. Kenesha's arrival in the courtroom was a defiant act, a bold assertion that truth, when wielded with courage, could pierce through the thick veil of corruption. She exchanged a brief nod with a few familiar faces in the crowd, supportive colleagues, community activists, and even a few disillusioned citizens who had long lost faith in the system. Their silent solidarity bolstered her resolve, and with a deep, steadying breath, she stepped forward. In that charged moment, as she ascended the courthouse steps toward the entrance of the courtroom, Kenesha felt both the weight of her past and the promise of a new future. Every fiber of her being was ready to confront the challenges ahead, whether they were the sneering doubts of a prejudiced judge or the hidden machinations of those who had built their fortunes on deceit. The air was electric with expectation, and as the grand doors of the courtroom swung open, Kenesha Harper crossed the threshold, determined to reclaim not just a case, but the very essence of justice itself. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere immediately shifted from hushed anticipation to a charged tension as Kenesha Harper took her place on the witness stand. The ornate chamber, with its high vaulted ceilings and intricately carved wooden panels, was filled with an eclectic mix of local citizens, media representatives, and legal professionals. All eyes turned toward her as she adjusted her posture, the weight of her responsibility evident in every deliberate movement. The air was heavy with expectation, yet there was an undercurrent of disdain, a sentiment that had long been directed at her by those who underestimated her simply because of her heritage. From the bench, Judge Milton Carver presided with a gravitas that bordered on arrogance. His stern, lined face and traditional black robes gave him an air of authority that was further amplified by the echoes of his gavel. Yet as Knesha began to outline her testimony, presenting meticulously organized evidence of a sprawling financial fraud, the judge's expression shifted. With a dismissive sneer curling his lips, he interjected with a tone that dripped with condescension. His voice, loud and scoffing, reverberated through the room as he questioned her methods and even went so far as to mock her credentials. He laughed, a deep, derisive laugh that filled the courtroom and sent a ripple of shock through the gallery. The sound, jarring and inappropriate for the solemnity of the proceedings, underscored a deep-seated prejudice that seemed to lurk behind his every word. For a moment, time seemed to slow as Knesha's heart pounded with a mixture of humiliation and burning indignation. Every eye in the room flicked nervously between the judge and the witness, as if waiting for the next blow. The judge's laughter was not only a personal affront but a public spectacle that threatened to undermine the integrity of the entire trial. Yet even as the sneering remarks poured forth, Knesha maintained her composure. She had trained for this moment, a moment when her voice, tempered by years of hardship and dedication, would stand as a testament to her unwavering commitment to truth. Summoning every ounce of her inner strength, Knesha continued her testimony, her voice steady and resolute despite the barbs aimed in her direction. She presented detailed charts and documents that traced irregular financial transactions back to a network of corrupt local officials. Each piece of evidence was laid out with clinical precision, a stark contrast to the judge's dismissive attitude. The room fell into a heavy silence as she spoke, her words cutting through the oppressive atmosphere like a scalpel. It was clear to everyone present that she was not merely a witness but an expert, one who had dedicated her career to uncovering the truth. At that pivotal moment, when the judge's ridicule reached its zenith, Knesha did something unexpected. With deliberate calm, she reached slowly into her leather briefcase and produced her U.S. Secret Service badge. The badge, glinting under the harsh courtroom lights, was more than a symbol, it was an emblem of authority earned through years of sacrifice and hard-won victories. As she flashed it for all to see, the mocking laughter in the courtroom faltered abruptly. Judge Carver's sneer melted into a look of frozen disbelief, his condescension replaced by an unmistakable shock. The gallery erupted into a mixture of gasps and murmurs, the balance of power shifting in that brief, electrifying moment. The impact of the badge reveal was immediate and profound. The judge's previous attempts to belittle her were rendered futile, and even the most skeptical members of the jury seemed to re-examine their preconceived notions. In that charged instant, the courtroom transformed from a stage for petty mockery into a battleground for justice. Knesha, emboldened by the undeniable symbol of her service, resumed her testimony with even greater determination. Her words now carried an aura of authority that resonated deeply with every listener, leaving no doubt as to her expertise and integrity. Outside, as whispers of admiration and support rippled through the crowd, the atmosphere in the courtroom underwent a subtle yet unmistakable transformation. The weight of her evidence, combined with the power of her unyielding resolve, began to eclipse the judge's attempts at derision. It was as if, in that single moment, the tide of prejudice had been turned, at least for the duration of the trial. Knesha's unwavering poise in the face of mockery and her fearless assertion of her authority not only reaffirmed her credibility but also lit a spark of hope among those who had long suffered under the weight of systemic injustice. As the session drew to a close, the courtroom remained charged with a newfound energy, a mixture of awe, relief, and a silent promise that the truth, no matter how forcefully suppressed, would ultimately prevail. Knesha Harper's testimony, underscored by that pivotal moment when her badge shone like a beacon of justice, marked the beginning of a transformative journey. In that moment it was clear that her fight was not just against corruption or prejudice, it was a battle for the very soul of the justice system, and it had only just begun after that electrifying moment when her badge gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. The air itself seemed to shift. The judge's once derisive gaze had faltered, and even the most skeptical jurors now regarded Kanesha with a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. For a long, suspended moment, silence reigned as the courtroom absorbed the weight of what had just transpired. Kanesha's heart pounded in her chest as she steadied herself, aware that her next words would determine not only the outcome of her testimony but might also serve as a turning point in a trial that had already exposed the deep rot festering within the system. Drawing a slow, deliberate breath, she resumed her testimony with a calm intensity that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Her voice, measured yet resolute, began to outline the painstakingly gathered evidence of financial fraud and political collusion. With each word, she recounted a series of transactions and hidden dealings that tied local officials to a vast network of corruption. She described how secret meetings were held in back rooms of nondescript offices, and how whispers of illegal bribes had circulated for months. As she spoke, her tone shifted from factual to impassioned, revealing not only her professional expertise but also the personal stakes that drove her, the memory of every time she had been underestimated and every moment of injustice that she had silently endured. The judge, Judge Carver, attempted to recover his composure, his face a mask of incredulity mixed with a trace of chagrin, as if the public display of authority had undermined his years of influence. Yet even as he tried to interject, Kanesha's words cascaded like a torrent. She laid out charts and graphs, each meticulously annotated, that traced irregularities in bank records and financial statements. The evidence, presented with the precision of a seasoned investigator, painted a damning picture of a system designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Every detail, from the covert transfer of funds to the unexplained withdrawals that spiked just before major political events, was laid bare, leaving little room for doubt. Throughout her testimony, Kanesha maintained eye contact with every member of the courtroom, as if daring anyone to challenge the veracity of her findings. In the gallery, whispers of approval rippled through the crowd. A few members of the public, previously silent and uncertain, now exchanged glances of admiration. Even some of the opposing counsel seemed to reconsider their earlier skepticism. The shift was palpable. The room had transformed from a stage of subtle derision into a battleground where the truth was being fiercely championed. At one point, when a particularly damning piece of evidence was introduced, a set of encrypted emails that detailed secret deals between city officials and undisclosed financial brokers, she paused and allowed the weight of the revelation to settle over the room. Her eyes flashed with a fierce determination as she explained how these emails, once decrypted, revealed instructions for covering up irregularities and diverting funds. It was a moment of undeniable clarity, and the evidence spoke for itself. The opposing counsel was left scrambling for a counterargument, while the judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier mockery now replaced by a dawning awareness that the trial had taken an unexpected turn. As the minutes ticked by, Kanesha deftly fielded questions from both the prosecution and defense. Her responses were calm and precise, each answer further reinforcing the meticulous nature of her investigation. Even when challenged with aggressive cross-examination tactics designed to discredit her expertise, she remained unfazed. It was as though every word she uttered was a carefully honed instrument, cutting through layers of deception and prejudice. The energy in the room, once oppressive and heavy with disdain, began to lighten as the truth emerged with undeniable force. Behind the scenes, whispers of her courage began to ripple through the corridors of power. Fellow agents, investigative journalists, and even some local citizens who had once doubted the system's integrity started to speak up. Their voices, once stifled by fear, now resonated with a cautious optimism that change was at hand. The trial was no longer just about a single case of financial misdeeds, it had become a symbol of the struggle against an entrenched culture of corruption and bias. By the time Kanesha concluded her testimony, the courtroom had transformed into a forum for accountability. The silence that followed was not one of stunned disbelief alone, but a collective moment of recognition that something profound was unfolding. Judge Carver, visibly diminished in his previous arrogance, tapped his gavel with a measured hand, signaling that the proceedings would continue, but the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. As the session adjourned, Kanesha stepped down from the stand with a quiet dignity that belied the storm of emotions swirling within her. The echoes of her testimony lingered long after she had left the room. In that moment, the fight for justice had gained a powerful new voice, one that would continue to resonate in every whispered conversation, every fervent call for reform, and every determined act of courage to come. The seeds of change had been planted, and as the courthouse doors closed behind her, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a transformative journey, a journey where the unyielding light of truth began to pierce the long-held shadows of prejudice and corruption. After the session adjourned, the courthouse buzzed with an energy that was both turbulent and electric, a palpable shift in the air that marked the beginning of a long, uncertain journey. Kenesha Harper stepped away from the witness stand into a quiet corridor, her mind still reverberating with the echoes of her testimony. In that moment, as she navigated the marble halls with measured steps, she could sense that the impact of her words was already rippling outward, challenging the old order that had long silenced voices like hers. In the hushed space of the atrium, she paused for a moment beneath a grand clock that ticked steadily, each chime a reminder of the relentless march of time and change. Her thoughts drifted back to the humiliation she had endured, the sneering laughter of Judge Carver, and now, that moment of frozen disbelief when her badge had shattered his veneer of authority. The memory ignited within her a quiet, persistent fire. Though her heart still pounded with the residual sting of past injustices, she felt resolute. This was not the end, but the spark that would fuel a much larger crusade. Outside the courthouse, the early afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, casting vibrant patches of color on the marble floor. Journalists and onlookers gathered in small clusters, their voices low and intense as they discussed what they had just witnessed. Among them, a few influential community leaders and former law enforcement officers exchanged meaningful glances, each aware that the courtroom spectacle was a harbinger of the coming tide of accountability. The media, once complicit in downplaying the corruption, now had a powerful narrative to share, an agent who had defied entrenched prejudice and boldly revealed the truth. Kenesha's own team quickly mobilized. Trayvon Alston, a sharp-minded and steadfast colleague who had always admired her dedication, met her at a quiet cafe near the courthouse. Over steaming cups of coffee in the muted clatter of cups and conversation, Trayvon expressed his deep admiration for her performance, his tone a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. "What you did in there, flashing your badge like that, it wasn't just a statement. It was a declaration of war against the injustice we've all suffered under for too long," he said, his eyes reflecting both pride and concern. Her mind, still swirling with the day's events, began to process the larger implications of her testimony. The evidence she had presented was only the beginning. Beneath the surface lay a web of corruption that extended far beyond Meridian's borders. As they discussed strategies for the next steps, Trayvon revealed that several independent auditors had already requested access to the financial records she had meticulously documented. This revelation, combined with the passionate outcry of local citizens, signaled that the pressure was mounting on the corrupt network, forcing it into an increasingly defensive position. Later that afternoon, as Kenesha returned to her modest apartment, a small, functional space that served as her sanctuary, she found a neatly folded envelope waiting on her doormat. Inside were several photocopied documents and a handwritten note warning her to cease her investigation, signed only with the initials CD. The message was chilling, its intent unmistakable. The powerful conspirators were now aware of her efforts and were prepared to silence her if necessary. Despite the fear that prickled at the edges of her resolve, Kenesha set the envelope aside and began to organize the documents with clinical precision. Each piece of evidence was a weapon in the fight for justice, and she knew that to back down now would be to betray every person who had ever suffered under a corrupt system. That evening, under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, Kenesha convened a meeting with a small group of trusted allies in a discreet location, a converted loft in an old warehouse on the fringe of the city. Among those present were Trayvon, several fellow agents, and a few respected community advocates who had long been disillusioned by the system's failures. In the dim light of a single lamp, they laid out their plan for the coming days. Maps, spreadsheets, and scanned documents formed a mosaic of resistance, a blueprint to dismantle the corrupt network piece by piece. The room was charged with a mixture of determination and vulnerability, every participant knew that the stakes were higher than ever. Yet the shared commitment to truth forged a bond among them, a solidarity that transcended fear. In that secret meeting, voices rose and fell in measured tones as they strategized the best way to release their findings to the public without compromising their sources or endangering lives. They discussed leveraging social media, collaborating with independent journalists, and even approaching sympathetic members of the state government to push for an independent investigation. Kanesha listened intently, her mind mapping out every detail, every contingency. As the meeting drew to a close, she felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly upon her shoulders, but also a spark of hope. The oppressive forces of corruption might be formidable, but they were not invincible. After the meeting, as the rain began to patter softly against the windows of her apartment, Kanesha sat at her desk and began drafting a detailed report on everything that had transpired that day. Each word was imbued with the determination to see justice prevail, to hold accountable those who had long operated in the shadows of power. The report would later become a cornerstone of the investigation, a testament to her unyielding commitment to the truth, and a rallying cry for every citizen who had ever felt silenced by an unjust system. In the quiet solitude of that rain-soaked night, with the storm outside mirroring the internal turbulence of her thoughts, Kanesha Harper realized that her fight was far from over. The courtroom battle had been a critical victory, but it was only the first step in a long and arduous journey to dismantle systemic corruption. Every threat, every act of intimidation, would only serve to strengthen her resolve. In that moment, as she gazed out of her window at the glistening city streets below, she silently vowed that no matter the cost, she would continue to shine the light of truth until every last shadow of injustice was banished. And so, in the relentless cadence of the rain and the quiet hum of the night, the next chapter of her transformative quest began to take shape. In the days following the secret meeting, Kanesha Harper and her trusted circle found themselves immersed in a world of covert operations and high-stakes investigation. The plan they had carefully outlined in that dimly lit loft was now in full swing. Kanesha, along with Trayvon Alston and a few other dedicated agents, established a secure communications hub in a nondescript safe house on the edge of Meridian. This modest, windowless building became their temporary command center, a place where encrypted messages, scanned documents, and live surveillance feeds converged into a single repository of truth. Every morning, as the city began its routine hustle, Kanesha would rise before dawn to review the latest intelligence. The atmosphere in the safe house was charged with urgency and quiet determination. Maps were spread across a large table, marked with red pins and color-coded strings that traced the labyrinthine network of corruption. Financial ledgers, intercepted emails, and internal memos, some dating back years, were methodically organized in digital folders. Trayvon's steady voice, calm and precise, would often break the silence as he recounted new tips from independent auditors or revelations from whistleblowers who risked everything to speak out. Each piece of evidence was a fragment of a larger puzzle, one that, once assembled, would expose not only the fraudulent financial schemes but also the insidious collusion between high-ranking officials and criminal networks. As the investigation deepened, Kanesha took on a dual role. In the courtroom, her earlier testimony had shaken the established order, and now, outside, she became the spearhead of a grassroots movement for transparency. Local community leaders, emboldened by her courage, began to hold discreet meetings in community centers and even in the back rooms of small businesses. They exchanged stories of bribery and intimidation, each narrative reinforcing the urgent need for reform. Kanesha's team discreetly recorded these testimonies, gathering accounts from those who had been marginalized by the corrupt system. Every recorded conversation, every handwritten note, added layers of credibility to the burgeoning case. One rainy afternoon, while meticulously cross-referencing bank statements with public records, Kanesha received a breakthrough tip from an unexpected source, a retired accountant named Melvin Orr, whose meticulous nature had once made him an indispensable asset to the local government. Melvin, speaking through a secure phone line, revealed that several key financial transactions had been funneled through shell companies, with funds mysteriously disappearing into offshore accounts. He described a particular series of transfers that coincided with major political events, suggesting deliberate manipulation of public funds. His voice trembled with both excitement and apprehension, aware that his revelations could cost him dearly if they fell into the wrong hands. Knesha assured him of anonymity and protection, her tone firm and reassuring, and promised that his information would be the linchpin in their campaign against corruption. Emboldened by this new evidence, Knesha and Trayvon devised a strategy to publicly expose the depth of the conspiracy. They planned a coordinated release of information to trusted journalists and independent media outlets. Over several late-night sessions, they compiled an extensive dossier, complete with video interviews, scanned documents, and digital footprints that traced illicit transactions back to a cabal of local officials. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a damning picture of a system deliberately designed to divert funds and manipulate outcomes. Trayvon's expertise with digital forensics lent further weight to the findings, as he carefully decrypted emails and pieced together the timeline of events that had led to widespread fraud. As the pressure mounted, the corrupt network began to react. Rumors of internal leaks and potential investigations started to circulate among those involved. Knesha received a series of anonymous warnings, emails with ominous subject lines and handwritten notes left on her doorstep. One such note, scrawled in hurried, jagged letters, warned, "Stop now or face consequences." The threat, while chilling, only steeled her resolve. Every act of intimidation, instead of deterring her, became further evidence of the lengths to which these individuals were willing to go to protect their secrets. In a daring move, Knesha arranged a clandestine meeting with one of the mid-level officials implicated in the scheme. The meeting took place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Meridian, a dilapidated structure shrouded in shadow and mystery. Under the cover of darkness, the official, visibly nervous and hesitant, agreed to share details about his superior's involvement. In a hushed, urgent tone, he recounted how directives were issued to suppress evidence and ensure that any whistleblower would be silenced through intimidation or worse. His confession was recorded with crystal clarity by one of Trayvon's discreet devices. That night, as Knesha replayed the recording in the safety of the command center, she felt a surge of vindication. Every word confirmed the suspicions she had harbored for months and provided the final pieces needed to expose the full scope of the corruption. By the end of the week, the dossier had evolved into an explosive compilation of evidence. The strategy for a coordinated media release was finalized, with trusted journalists scheduled to break the story across multiple platforms simultaneously. Knesha organized a press conference at a local community center, where a large crowd of concerned citizens had already gathered, drawn by rumors of imminent change. In that moment, as cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position, she knew that the battle for truth was about to enter its most public phase yet. Standing at the podium, Knesha looked out over the sea of faces, each one reflecting the hope of a community that had long been suppressed by corruption. With measured resolve and unwavering clarity, she began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of every sacrifice made in the pursuit of justice. The detailed evidence, laid out in clear, accessible terms, left no doubt: the financial fraud, the coercion, the deliberate manipulation of public funds, and the collusion between government officials and criminal networks were not isolated incidents but part of a calculated, systemic effort to steal from the people. That day, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the lingering darkness, the story of Meridian's corruption was splashed across headlines and broadcast on national television. Knesha's courageous investigation had ignited a firestorm of public outrage, and as the exposé unfolded, it became evident that the wheels of justice were finally turning. In the midst of this transformative moment, her allies, Trayvon, Melvin, and many others, joined her on stage, each a symbol of resilience and the unyielding power of truth. The evidence they had gathered was not merely a collection of numbers and documents, but a testament to the strength of a community united against injustice. In that historic press conference, the intricate web of deceit was laid bare for the world to see, marking a turning point not just for Meridian, but for every citizen who had ever believed that corruption was an unstoppable force. Knesha Harper's journey from quiet determination to public heroism had reached a crescendo, a moment where the long, arduous struggle for justice would finally begin to bear fruit, and the oppressive shadows of corruption would be driven out by the bright, unrelenting light of accountability. In the weeks that followed the courtroom spectacle, the tide began to turn as the long-hidden corruption in Meridian was exposed with unrelenting force. Under mounting public pressure, independent auditors and federal investigators were called in to dissect the evidence Kenesha Harper had so meticulously presented. The media, once content to echo the judge's dismissive tone, now blasted headlines that painted a damning picture of collusion, embezzlement, and systemic injustice. Every day, new revelations emerged: secret meetings in smoke-filled rooms, back-channel bank transfers, and clandestine communications that directly implicated high-ranking officials. The scandal, which had once been a local whisper, now roared through the airwaves and dominated national news. Kenesha, now recognized as the catalyst for change, found herself inundated with requests for interviews and inquiries from across the country. Yet amidst the newfound acclaim, she remained focused on her mission. Together with her steadfast partner Trayvon Alston and a cadre of dedicated colleagues, she dove headlong into the investigation, determined to leave no stone unturned. Late-night strategy sessions at their secure command center became a daily ritual, as they pieced together the sprawling network of corruption with the precision of seasoned detectives. Every encrypted email, every financial record, was scrutinized, revealing an intricate web of deceit that extended far beyond Meridian's city limits. In one pivotal breakthrough, forensic accountants uncovered a series of suspicious transactions linking a shell company, purportedly a mundane local business, to millions of dollars funneled into offshore accounts. These funds, it turned out, were used to bribe influential figures and secure preferential treatment in city contracts. The evidence was irrefutable. Public outcry surged as details of the scheme were broadcast across television screens and splashed across newspapers. Citizens who had long suffered under the weight of corruption now found their voices amplified by the media, and grassroots movements began to form, demanding accountability in sweeping reforms. Meanwhile, Judge Milton Carver, whose early mockery had sparked Kenesha's fateful badge flash, found himself increasingly isolated. His once commanding courtroom demeanor gave way to furtive glances and hushed murmurs among his peers. With the evidence mounting and public sentiment shifting, calls for his resignation grew louder by the day. A committee of legal experts and civil rights advocates was formed to investigate judicial misconduct, and Carver's legacy, once one of unquestioned authority, began to crumble under the relentless scrutiny of the people he had once dismissed. Throughout this turbulent period, Kenesha continued to walk the fine line between duty and personal risk. Threatening messages, both veiled and explicit, still arrived at her doorstep, warning her to cease her investigation. Yet each threat only served to fortify her resolve. Late one evening, after a particularly tense day of interviews with whistleblowers and community leaders, she sat alone in her modest apartment, the glow of her computer screen illuminating stacks of confidential reports. With a deep, steadying breath, she vowed silently that no amount of intimidation would force her to abandon her pursuit of the truth. Her tireless efforts began to have a tangible impact on Meridian's political landscape. The newly appointed Oversight Committee launched a series of independent audits into municipal contracts and financial records. High-ranking officials, once shielded by layers of bureaucratic obfuscation, were summoned to testify before Congress. The corridors of power, which had once echoed with the laughter of those who thought themselves untouchable, were now filled with apprehension and uncertainty. Community rallies, organized by local activists inspired by Kenesha's courage, swelled in size as people demanded justice and transparency. For many citizens, this was the first time in decades that they felt truly heard, a collective awakening that promised to reshape the future of their city. In the midst of these upheavals, Kenesha received a personal message from Trayvon. He reminded her that while the fight was far from over, the progress they had made was a victory in itself, a victory for every person who had ever been silenced by corruption. Their conversation, recorded in hurried, impassioned text messages, underscored the fragile hope that had blossomed amid the chaos. Together, They began drafting a comprehensive plan to safeguard the new reforms, ensuring that the revelations of corruption would lead not just to temporary outrage, but to lasting change. As the investigation pressed forward, the public and private sectors alike were forced to reckon with the legacy of injustice that had long festered in Meridian. For Kenesha Harper, the journey had evolved from a personal quest for vindication into a movement, a beacon for those who believed that integrity could prevail even in the darkest of times. The relentless pursuit of evidence, the strategic unveiling of hidden truths, and the unwavering support of a community united against corruption all coalesced into a transformative force that threatened to overturn a system built on silence and complacency. In the wake of these dramatic developments, as dawn broke over a city on the brink of a new era, Kenesha felt a renewed sense of purpose. The labyrinth of deceit was being unraveled, thread by thread, and with each revelation, the promise of justice grew brighter. It was a testament to the indomitable human spirit, the belief that even in a world mired in corruption, the truth, when championed with courage and persistence, would ultimately prevail. And so, as Meridian prepared to enter a future defined by accountability and reform, Kenesha Harper stood at the forefront of the charge, a steadfast guardian of justice whose journey was far from over but whose resolve had never been stronger. Under the weight of growing public pressure and a tidal wave of evidence, the stage was set for a moment that would redefine Meridian's future. In a packed congressional hearing held in a cavernous government chamber, Kenesha Harper stood before an assembly of determined lawmakers, investigative journalists, and citizens hungry for accountability. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation as she prepared to lay bare the labyrinth of corruption that had not only framed her father's fate but had undermined the very foundation of local governance. Every eye in the room was fixed on her as she adjusted the microphone, her steady gaze cutting through the murmurs of discontent and disbelief. In those tense moments before she began, memories of long nights spent poring over documents and dodging threats surged through her mind. She recalled the clandestine meetings in dimly lit back rooms, the anxious whispers of allies risking everything for the truth, and the many times her resolve had been tested by intimidation. Now, as she stood at the podium, Kenesha embodied the hope of an entire community. With a measured breath, she launched into her testimony, recounting the painstaking investigation that had uncovered a network of illicit financial transactions, manipulated bank records, and covert communications between corrupt officials and criminal entities. Her voice, resonant and unwavering, filled the room with the urgency of a truth that had long been buried. She presented detailed charts and timelines that mapped out suspicious transfers and secret meetings, explaining how millions of dollars had been siphoned off through shell companies and offshore accounts. Each statistic was accompanied by first-hand accounts and recorded confessions from former insiders who had risked their careers to reveal what they had witnessed. Kenesha's narrative was methodical and precise, yet it carried a palpable passion that spoke to the personal cost of the corruption, costs borne by her family and the community alike. As she unfolded the layers of deceit, she also recounted the humiliating moments in the courtroom when prejudice had reared its head, and how that moment of defiant resolve, flashing her badge, had become a rallying cry for justice. The hearing hall was transformed into a battlefield of ideas and accountability. Lawmakers peppered her with incisive questions, eager to understand the mechanisms that allowed such a deep-seated conspiracy to thrive. With each query, Kenesha answered in a tone that balanced technical expertise with heartfelt conviction. She detailed the role of key players, naming individuals whose names had once evoked trust but who now stood accused of greed and collusion. Her testimony painted a picture of a system so deeply compromised that even those charged with upholding the law had fallen under the shadow of corruption. At one point, a veteran congressman, his voice rough with emotion, asked, "How could our institutions allow this to happen? How many lives have been tarnished by this betrayal?" Kenesha paused, her eyes momentarily softening as she considered the human cost of the injustice. "Countless lives," she replied, "and each one is a reminder that no system is infallible. But we have the power to change that, to hold our leaders accountable, and to ensure that truth prevails over self-interest." As the hearing progressed, the sound of her testimony began to resonate far beyond the chamber's walls. Television cameras captured every moment, and social media buzzed with live updates that brought the unfolding drama into homes across the nation. Independent media outlets, once muted in their criticism of local power structures, now broadcast her words with fervor, sparking widespread public debate. The evidence was laid bare for all to see, a meticulously constructed dossier that left little room for denial or excuse. The momentum in the room shifted palpably. What had begun as a tense interrogation of corruption evolved into a collective demand for reform. The climax of the hearing came when a coalition of bipartisan legislators, moved by the clarity and resolve in Kanesh's testimony, called for the immediate establishment of an independent oversight committee to investigate the rampant corruption in Meridian. Their impassioned declarations were met with thunderous applause and a standing ovation from many in the gallery. It was a moment of catharsis, a public acknowledgement that the long-suffering citizens of Meridian had a right to expect honesty and accountability from those entrusted with power. By the end of that historic session, Kanesh's testimony had not only exposed a sprawling web of corruption but had also ignited a flame of reform that promised sweeping changes in local governance. The hearing was hailed as a turning point, a moment when the collective voice of justice had broken through the oppressive silence of institutional complicity. As the lawmakers adjourned, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air, a belief that the revelations of that day would usher in a new era of transparency and integrity. In the quiet aftermath, as cameras and reporters continued to buzz outside the chamber, Kanesha stepped away from the podium. The weight of the day's events pressed upon her, but beneath it all burned a fierce hope. She knew that the battle was far from over, the forces of corruption were formidable, and the road to genuine reform would be long and fraught with challenges. Yet, in that charged moment, amid the resolute faces of those who had dared to demand change, Kanesha Harper stood as a symbol of unwavering courage, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be dismantled by the power of truth, determination, and a collective will to reclaim justice for every soul wronged by deceit. In the weeks following the explosive congressional hearing, the winds of change swept through Meridian with a determined, unstoppable force. The city, once shrouded in a thick pall of corruption and systemic injustice, began to awaken to a new era of accountability and transparency. The public outcry, amplified by live broadcasts and social media, forced the hand of the authorities. Under intense pressure from a coalition of reform-minded legislators and impassioned citizens, an independent oversight committee was swiftly established to probe the depths of the corruption that had tainted the local government. This marked the beginning of a comprehensive reform movement that would reshape the entire political landscape of Meridian. Judge Milton Carver, whose condescension had once been the emblem of an outdated system, found his position untenable. Facing mounting investigations and public humiliation, he resigned amidst a storm of scandal and bitter protests. His departure signified a symbolic break with the past, a clear rejection of the prejudices and abuses that had long festered in the corridors of power. In his place, a new generation of judges and officials, committed to fairness and transparency, was appointed. The transformation was not instantaneous, but every small step, every resignation, every audit, every public forum, contributed to the gradual dismantling of the corrupt network that had once thrived in secrecy. Kanesha Harper emerged as an icon of justice and resilience, her courage in the face of adversity now celebrated not only in Meridian but across the nation. Her testimony, the pivotal moment when she had boldly flashed her U.S. Secret Service badge in defiance of prejudice, had become a rallying cry for those who believed that truth could still triumph over entrenched power. Invitations poured in from community organizations, civil rights groups, and even national media outlets eager to share her story. Kanesha was lauded for her unwavering integrity, her steadfast pursuit of the truth, and her unyielding dedication to reform. In a grand ceremony held in the newly renovated Civic Center, a building that now symbolized the city's commitment to change, she was honored with a prestigious public service award. The ceremony was attended by a sea of supporters, from grateful citizens whose lives had been touched by her work to reformist politicians whose careers were now built on the promise of accountability. Amid the public celebrations, Kanesha continued her work with quiet determination. She collaborated with the Independent Oversight Committee to ensure that new safeguards were implemented to prevent any recurrence of the old abuses. Workshops and town hall meetings were organized to educate citizens on their rights and the importance of holding their leaders accountable. The media, once a vehicle for dismissive stereotypes and biased portrayals, had transformed into a vigilant watchdog, one that relentlessly pursued stories of good governance and transparent administration. Investigative reports unveiled detailed accounts of the corruption that had been rooted out, and these exposés galvanized even more residents to participate in the process of rebuilding their community. In a touching turn of events, several of the very officials who had been implicated in the scandal began to cooperate with the investigation, offering testimonies that further clarified the extent of the wrongdoing. Their admissions, though painful, became the catalyst for sweeping legal reforms and a series of prosecutions that sent shockwaves throughout the region. The once formidable network of corruption crumbled as key figures were held accountable, and the economic repercussions rippled through the corridors of power, leading to the reallocation of resources to benefit public education, infrastructure, and social services. For Kenesha, the personal toll of the struggle had been immense. Late nights spent poring over documents, constant threats, and the relentless pressure of standing against a system built on silence had left scars that, over time, had become symbols of her sacrifice. Yet, in every interview, in every public appearance, she carried herself with the grace and humility of someone who understood that true victory was not measured solely by accolades but by the restored faith of a community. In quiet moments, away from the adulation and the media frenzy, she would reflect on the journey that had brought her here, from the courtroom confrontation that had ignited a fire in her heart to the arduous nights in her secure command center, assembling the puzzle that would ultimately expose a vast conspiracy. As autumn faded into winter, Meridian began to thrive in ways that had once seemed unimaginable. The streets, once rife with whispers of despair, now resonated with the sounds of community festivals, open-air markets, and heartfelt celebrations of cultural diversity. Neighborhoods that had once been paralyzed by fear blossomed with newfound vigor, as residents took active roles in civic life, forming committees and neighborhood watch groups that monitored local governance. Schools introduced programs that taught young people about civic responsibility, and public art installations commemorated the struggle for justice, each mural and sculpture a reminder that the fight for truth was a shared legacy. One crisp winter evening, as soft snow blanketed the city in a serene, white hush, Kenesha stood before a crowd gathered in the town square. The air was filled with the gentle sound of a piano and the murmurs of people united in hope. In that moment, she recounted her journey, not just as a battle fought by one determined agent, but as a collective triumph over prejudice and corruption. Her words, sincere and powerful, touched the hearts of everyone present. "We have shown that no system, no matter how deeply entrenched, is immune to the light of truth," she declared, her voice steady and resolute. "Together, we have reclaimed our city and, in doing so, have reminded the world that justice can prevail when we stand united." As the crowd erupted into applause and the city lights shimmered like stars against the winter night, Kenesha felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The wounds of the past would take time to heal, but the transformation of Meridian had begun, a transformation built on the relentless courage of those who dared to speak out, on the unwavering determination to hold the powerful accountable, and on the profound belief that every act of truth was a step toward a brighter future. In that moment, as Meridian embraced a new dawn of transparency and hope, Kenesha Harper's journey stood as a testament to the enduring power of resilience. The story that had started with scorn and derision had, through countless trials and sacrifices, blossomed into a beacon of change, a legacy that promised to illuminate the path forward for generations to come.